Have you ever wondered what the real secret weapon was that helped the Allies win World War II? It wasn't a new kind of bomb or a faster tank. The truth is, one of the most powerful weapons that turned the tide of the war was an industrial miracle. A miracle performed not by master craftsmen with decades of experience, but by an army of former secretaries, farmers, housewives, and laborers, everyday Americans who had only just learned how to weld. This is the story of World War II's greatest secret, a tale of how these untrained workers achieved the impossible and built a Liberty ship in 4 days, a feat that should have taken the better part of a year. Picture this. November 12th, 1942. Richmond, California. The air, usually filled with the deafening roar of machinery and the sharp hiss of welding torches, falls into a strange, expectant silence. A massive cargo vessel, 441 feet long and weighing over 14,000 tons, stands complete, casting a long shadow over the crowd below. This wasn't just any ship. This was the SS Robert E. Peary. And it had been assembled, from its very first steel plate laid down to this launch-ready state, in an unbelievable 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Let that sink in for a moment. For centuries, since before the American Revolution, building a ship of this magnitude was a painstaking craft. Master shipwrights and their apprentices would labor for 6 to 8 months, carefully shaping each piece, hammering home 1,000,000 rivets one by one. Yet here, a workforce of over 1,000 people, most of whom couldn't have told a hull from a deck a few months prior, stepped back from a completed vessel. They had shattered a centuries-old record not by a little, but by an order of magnitude. In this video, we're not just going to tell you that it happened, we're going to uncover the secret of how it happened. We'll dive into the mind of the maverick who orchestrated it all, a man who'd never built a ship in his life, and celebrate the quiet heroes who answered the call. Stick with me, because what they accomplished together will redefine what you believe is humanly possible. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this miracle, we have to travel back to a time of absolute desperation. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was a bloodbath. The Atlantic Ocean had become a vast, cold graveyard for Allied shipping. German U-boats, the infamous wolf packs, were hunting in the dark, silent depths, unleashing torpedoes with devastating efficiency. They were sinking Allied ships far faster than anyone in the world could build them. The numbers were terrifying. For every new supply ship that slid into the water, 3 more were torn apart by explosions and sent to the ocean floor. Britain was on its knees, literally starving. The island nation depended entirely on these sea lanes for food, fuel, and weapons. Every sunken ship meant less food for families, fewer bullets for soldiers, less fuel for the Spitfires fighting in the skies. The German strategy was simple and brutal. Choke the life out of Great Britain and sever the logistical artery connecting America to the European front. And it was working. The most experienced shipyards in America and Britain, with their time-honored methods, were fighting a losing battle against time. At their current pace, the war would be lost. The clock was ticking, not in days or weeks, but in hours. Into this seemingly hopeless crisis stepped a man who, by all accounts, had absolutely no business building ships. His name was Henry J. Kaiser. At 58 years old, Kaiser was a titan of American industry. But his kingdom was built on land. He was a force of nature, a larger-than-life character who had spent his career wrestling mountains and taming rivers. He was the man behind the massive Hoover and Grand Coulee dams, a visionary who knew how to move earth and pour concrete on a scale that boggled the mind. He knew everything about building highways, pipelines, and cement plants. The one thing he knew nothing about was the intricate, almost sacred art of shipbuilding. So when this 8-year-old construction magnate walked into the offices of the United States Maritime Commission and promised he could build 30 cargo vessels for the desperate British government, the old guard of the shipbuilding world didn't just doubt him, they openly laughed at him. The established shipbuilders, families who had passed their craft down through generations, saw him as a naive opportunist, a concrete man who was completely out of his depth. They scoffed at his ignorance of maritime tradition, his lack of respect for the meticulous processes they held dear. They reluctantly partnered with him, assuming their expertise would have to bail out his inevitable failures. What none of these experts understood, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Henry Kaiser's complete lack of shipbuilding experience wasn't his weakness. It was his greatest weapon. He wasn't burdened by centuries of tradition telling him what couldn't be done. He didn't see the rules. He only saw the problem. And the problem was simple. And it needed ships, and it needed them yesterday. His mind, unchained by convention, was free to ask a question that would terrify the establishment and change the course of the war. What if we don't build ships at all? What if we manufacture them? The journey from skepticism to revolution began not on the shipyard floor, but in a stuffy planning office in New York. In early 1941, as Henry Kaiser and his team of engineers sat across from the seasoned experts at Todd Shipyards, the air was thick with tension. Spread across the tables were the traditional blueprints for a cargo ship, documents that were treated less like plans and more like sacred texts. For the Todd engineers, these drawings represented 300 years of accumulated wisdom. But for Kaiser's men, they represented a dead end. They immediately recognized that following these conventional methods would be like trying to put out a forest fire with a water bucket. It would never, ever meet the wartime demand. The first true clash of worlds came from Kaiser's chief engineer, a man named Clay Bedford. Just weeks earlier, Bedford had taken a trip that would change history. He had walked the floor of a Ford Motor Company assembly line in Detroit. He wasn't looking at cars. He was watching a process, a symphony of efficiency. He saw bare chassis roll in at one end and complete automobiles drive off at the other, with workers at each station adding pre-made components in a seamless flow. He returned to Kaiser with an idea that, to the traditional shipbuilding world, sounded like absolute blasphemy. He was convinced that ships, these colossal, complex titans of the sea, could be built in exactly the same way. The traditionalists in the room considered the comparison absurd, almost insulting. A ship, they argued, was not a tin can on wheels. It was a unique, handcrafted creation, an organism of steel where every plate and beam had to be fitted with artistic precision. It was a craft, not a manufacturing process. This wasn't just a technical disagreement. It was a fundamental conflict of philosophies. On one side was the proud, centuries-old tradition of the artisan, who saw beauty and strength in meticulous, sequential craftsmanship. On the other was the ruthless, pragmatic logic of the manufacturer, who saw only a problem of scale and speed that needed to be solved. The first real shockwave hit the room with Kaiser's proposal to eliminate riveting entirely. For as long as anyone could remember, the sound of shipbuilding was the rhythmic rat-a-tat-tat of the riveting hammer. It was a brutal, yet highly skilled dance. A four-man crew worked in perfect coordination. One heated the metal pins to a cherry-red glow. Another inserted them into holes through overlapping steel plates. A third hammered one end into a shape called a shop head, while the fourth bucked the other end, forming the final seal. It was loud, dangerous, and incredibly slow. A single Liberty ship, if built conventionally, required approximately 1 million rivets. An expert crew, on a good day, might install a few hundred. The math was a nightmare. Kaiser proposed a different path: electric arc welding. It was a technique he had mastered building massive pipelines across the American West. Welding was quieter, faster, and required fewer workers. But to the maritime establishment, it was a dangerously unproven technology for building the hull of a massive ship. They feared the welds would crack under the immense stress of the open ocean. Vice Admiral Emory Land, the powerful chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, examined Kaiser's proposal with profound skepticism. His private correspondence, preserved in the National Archives, reveals the establishment's deep-seated fear. Welding has never been proven reliable for hull construction at this scale, he wrote. The British Royal Navy forbids welding on warship hulls. Kaiser is proposing we bet America's supply lines on an unproven technology. Yet, Land and the Commission were trapped. They could trust the slow, proven methods and lose the war, or they could take a monumental gamble on the concrete man and his wild ideas. The constant reports of sunken ships were the deciding factor. Desperation forced their hand. The decision to approve Kaiser's contract wasn't a vote of confidence, it was an act of sheer necessity. It was a bet made not on certainty, but on the terrifying math of survival. With the contract signed, the revolution moved from the drawing board to the empty mudflats of Richmond, California. Between January and December of 1941, Kaiser's construction crews, the same men who built dams and highways, erected a facility that horrified traditional maritime engineers. An established shipyard was a carefully organized space, dominated by massive, covered gantry cranes and long, sloping building ways, where a ship's keel was laid and the hull was built up, piece by piece, from the bottom up. Richmond was something else entirely. It wasn't designed like a shipyard. It was laid out like a giant, outdoor automobile factory. Instead of one or two main building ways, it featured 7 parallel ways, allowing multiple ships to be assembled at once. These were surrounded by vast open areas dedicated to prefabrication. A spider web of railroad tracks crisscrossed the entire facility, designed not to move small parts, but to transport massive 150-ton sections of steel. And overhead, instead of a few large cranes, smaller cranes stood everywhere, like steel giraffes, ready to lift and move components with unprecedented speed and flexibility. The whole place was designed for one thing: the rapid assembly of prefabricated modules. In May of 1941, John Riley, the chief naval architect for the prestigious Bethlehem Steel Corporation and a 30-year veteran of shipbuilding, visited the Richmond yard to inspect the work in progress. His inspection report, marked confidential at the time, is a fascinating document, a mixture of technical criticism and grudging admiration. He was appalled by the seeming chaos. Kaiser has violated every principle of efficient shipyard layout I learned in 3 decades of experience, Riley wrote. His prefabrication areas are too large. His crane capacity is absurdly excessive. His building ways are too short. He saw a layout that defied all conventional wisdom, a system that seemed wasteful and illogical. But then, as he watched the process, a grudging understanding began to dawn. He concluded his report with a sentence that signaled the beginning of the end for the old way of thinking. Yet, he admitted, I must admit the facility is designed for exactly what he claims: rapid assembly of prefabricated sections. Riley, the master of traditional shipbuilding, couldn't deny what he was seeing. Kaiser wasn't building a better shipyard. He had built a completely different kind of machine, a factory whose final product just happened to be a 14 zero-ton cargo ship. The stage was now set. The revolutionary factory had been built. Now, it just needed an equally revolutionary army to run it. The revolutionary factory was built. But a factory is just steel and concrete. It needed a soul. It needed an army. Traditional shipyards drew their workforce from a small, exclusive pool of talent. Skills were a birthright, passed down from father to son over generations in tight-knit maritime communities along the East Coast. It was a closed world, dominated by a guild-like system that took years of apprenticeship to enter. Kaiser didn't have time for that. He needed tens of thousands of workers, and he needed them now. So, he did something unheard of. He advertised. He placed ads in newspapers across America, from the dusty farms of Oklahoma to the bustling cities of the Midwest. The ads promised good wages, 20% above the standard industrial rates, but more importantly, they promised opportunity and training for anyone willing to work. The response was a human tidal wave. A great migration began, as people packed their lives into rusty cars and crowded trains, all heading west towards a promise of a steady paycheck and a chance to contribute to the war effort. They poured into Richmond, California, a town whose population exploded from 23,000 to over 100,000 inches just 3 years. And this new workforce looked nothing like the old guard of shipbuilding. They weren't grizzled, seasoned craftsmen. They were young men who had never seen the ocean, farmers whose hands were more familiar with a plow than a welding torch, women who had left their kitchens and secretarial desks for the noise and grime of the shipyard. This was the second, and perhaps most profound, of Kaiser's revolutions. the democratization of skill. He fundamentally challenged the long-held belief that complex manufacturing required generational expertise. At the heart of this revolution was a radical new approach to training. A traditional welder or shipfitter spent 4 long years as an apprentice, learning every facet of their craft to become a master. Kaiser's training schools boiled that down to about 2 weeks. The secret was simplification and repetition. A new worker didn't need to learn how to weld everything. They only needed to learn one specific task and do it perfectly, over and over again. One person learned only how to weld the vertical seams on a bulkhead. Another learned only the horizontal welds on a deck plate. A third specialized in the curved sections of the hull. They became specialists not in the broad craft of welding, but in a single, repeatable action. Imagine a young woman named Sarah, who just months ago was typing memos in a quiet office. Now, she stood in a noisy training bay, a heavy helmet over her head, learning to control a brilliant, hissing arc of electricity. For 10 days, she did nothing but weld 2 pieces of steel together in a straight line. By the end of her training, she wasn't a master welder, but she was an expert at welding that one seam. Multiplied by tens of thousands, this army of specialists was devastatingly effective. By late 1941, Kaiser employed over 10,000 workers in Richmond. Fewer than 200 had any previous maritime experience. It was a workforce built from scratch. This created a level of workplace integration that was highly unusual for 1942 America. The urgent need for labor broke down social barriers that had stood for decades. At peak production, over 40,000 women worked in Kaiser's yards, making up more than a quarter of the entire production workforce. These Wendy the welders and Rosie the riveters weren't just token employees. They were operating massive overhead cranes, fitting heavy steel plates, and supervising teams. Similarly, tens of thousands of African American workers, who in other industries would have been relegated to the most menial jobs, were given the chance to work in skilled positions as welders, fitters, and electricians. For many, it was the first time they had been judged not by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their work. With this new army in place, the true power of Kaiser's assembly line approach was unleashed. The concept that had so confused traditionalists' parallel production was, in practice, a thing of beautiful, brutal efficiency. Think of it like this. In a traditional shipyard, building a ship was like climbing a ladder. You couldn't start step 2 until you finished step 1. You couldn't build the engine room until the hull was complete. You couldn't install the engine until the engine room was built. Everything happened in a slow, linear sequence, with different trades often waiting on each other in the cramped, dark confines of the hull. Kaiser's approach was more like building with giant Lego blocks that had been constructed simultaneously. While one crew was welding together massive plates to form a bow section in a spacious open-air workshop, a completely different crew, hundreds of yards away, was assembling the stern. At the same time, another team was building the entire deckhouse, the ship's apartment building, as a single, massive unit. And in yet another area, the colossal 140-ton steam engine was being fully assembled and tested on its foundation before it ever went near the ship. Albert Wooding, a production supervisor at the Richmond yard, explained the genius of the system in a 1943 interview. "Tasks that previously required weeks now take hours," he said. He described the engine installation as a prime example. In a conventional yard, 50 workers might spend 3 weeks painstakingly installing an engine piece by piece inside the cramped, partially finished engine room. At Richmond, a crew of 200 workers assembled the entire engine and its mounting structure in an open workshop in just 5 days. Then, a massive crane would lift the entire, completed assembly, all 140 tons of it, and lower it perfectly into the completed engine room in a single 8-hour operation. This was the core of the secret. Kaiser hadn't just made the old process faster, he had created an entirely new one. He treated shipbuilding not as a craft, but as a manufacturing and logistics problem. He even began to challenge the sanctity of the blueprints themselves. Traditional builders revered their detailed plans. Kaiser's yards, however, often worked from simplified drawings that provided only the basic dimensions, leaving the smaller details to the workers' and foreman's judgment on the floor. The old guard saw this as reckless heresy. Kaiser called it flexibility. It empowered his workers and allowed them to solve problems on the fly, eliminating the bureaucratic delays of waiting for an engineer to approve a minor change. As this revolutionary system of people and processes began to hum through late 1941 and early 1942, something incredible happened. The construction time for Liberty ships began to plummet. Kaiser's very first ship took a respectable, but not revolutionary, 197 days to complete. Ship number 5 took 128 days. By ship number 10, they were down to 97 days. Soon, they were completing ships in 70 days, then 60, then 50. This untrained, unskilled workforce of farmers and housewives was now building ships faster than the most experienced, highly skilled crews in the country. They weren't just matching the old records, they were preparing to obliterate them. The revolution was no longer a theory, it was a roaring, unstoppable reality. As construction speeds surged through the spring and summer of 1942, a new, powerful motivator emerged. Pride. An intense but friendly rivalry developed between Kaiser's various shipyards, which were spread across California, Oregon, and Washington. In particular, a fierce competition ignited between Clay Bedford's Richmond yards in California and the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation in Portland, managed by Kaiser's ambitious son, Edgar. The two men were cut from the same cloth, driven, innovative, and relentless. They began an informal contest to see whose facility could build ships faster. The race between Richmond and Portland became a public spectacle. Newspapers across the country started publishing updates on their production times like they were sports scores. Records didn't just fall, they were shattered on a weekly basis. Workers, caught up in the competitive spirit, pushed themselves and their new techniques to the absolute limit. The contest reached a stunning climax in September 1942, when the Portland shipyard built the SS Joseph N. Teal from keel laying to launch in an astonishing 10 days. The nation was captivated. A 0-ton cargo ship built in the time it takes to get a driver's license. It seemed like the ultimate expression of industrial might. The government, however, was getting nervous. Vice Admiral Vickery of the Maritime Commission, though impressed, eventually ordered the high-speed competitions to stop. He publicly declared them stunt demonstrations that wasted resources and distracted from the real production goals of the war. But the stunts had served Kaiser's purpose perfectly. They had transformed the psychology of the entire workforce. The impossible had been normalized. Across all 7 of his shipyards, workers now believed that extraordinary speed wasn't just a possibility. It was the standard they were expected to meet every single day. The 10-day ship had recalibrated the definition of fast, but Clay Bedford believed they could go faster still. He was just waiting for the right moment to prove it. That moment arrived in November 1942. Vice Admiral Emery Land, the same man who had once been so skeptical of welding, was visiting Richmond to inspect production. Standing before a crowd of journalists, the Admiral remarked how remarkably Liberty ship construction had improved. He praised their efforts, but then made a casual, off-hand comment that changed everything. He noted that while the recent 10-day record was impressive, it still paled in comparison to what true mass production had achieved in other industries, like automobile manufacturing. Most people would have heard that as a simple observation. But Clay Bedford, who was standing nearby, heard it as a direct challenge. A spark ignited in his eyes. He approached Vice Admiral Land with a proposal so audacious it bordered on insane. He proposed that Richmond Yard No. 2 would attempt to build a complete Liberty ship, from the very first plate of steel to a finished floating vessel, in under 5 days. He wasn't just aiming to beat the Joseph N. Teal's record of 10 days. He was proposing to cut it in half. Land was, once again, deeply skeptical. But he was also intrigued. The propaganda value alone would be immense. He authorized the attempt, but with one strict condition: it could not disrupt the regular production schedules of the other ships. Bedford readily agreed. This wasn't going to be a stunt that shut down the yard. It was going to be a demonstration of what his system, operating at peak efficiency, was truly capable of. He selected the 47th hull to be built at Yard Number 2 for the record attempt. The ship would be named the SS Robert E. Peary, after the famed Arctic explorer, a fitting name for a vessel that was about to venture into uncharted territory. The ultimate expression of Kaiser's prefabrication strategy was about to be put on display. In the days leading up to the attempt, the entire shipyard was a hive of meticulously planned activity. Every single major component of the ship was pre-built, inspected, and staged right beside the empty building way. It was like a giant model kit, with all the pieces laid out, ready for assembly. The entire bow section, weighing hundreds of tons and already fitted with anchor hardware and crew quarters, sat waiting. The stern section, complete with the steering gear and propeller shaft, was ready to go. The massive 140-ton triple expansion steam engine, built 50 miles away in Sunnyvale, had been delivered, mounted on its foundation, and fully tested. 4 complete cargo holds, each one a massive rectangular box of steel, were lined up in sequence. At precisely 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8th, a piercing whistle blew, and the race against time began. The first double-bottom section of the keel, a prefabricated module weighing 250 tons, was lifted by a chorus of cranes and lowered gently into place. The moment it touched the blocks, over 1,000 workers, operating in carefully coordinated shifts around the clock, swarmed the site. What followed was less like shipbuilding and more like a perfectly choreographed industrial ballet. Massive steel sections flew through the air, guided by crane operators with incredible precision, and were lowered into place where armies of welders descended, their torches spitting brilliant arcs of light that turned the night sky into day. Where conventional shipyards built upwards over months, Kaiser's yard was assembling outwards in days. By the end of day 1, the entire double bottom and most of the lower hull plates were in place. By day 2, the engine was installed and the bulkheads were secured. By day 3, the upper deck was complete. 4 days into construction, the hull was finished, the deck houses were positioned, and the masts were in place. The vessel was, for all intents and purposes, a complete ship. On Thursday, November 12th, a crowd of officials, military officers, rival shipyard owners, and journalists gathered. Many had come expecting to see a failure, or at best, a compromised vessel that looked complete on the outside but was a hollow shell. At 3:30 p.m., just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after that first keel section was laid, the signal was given. With a great groan of steel on wood, the SS Robert E. Peary slid gracefully down the launching rails and hit the waters of San Francisco Bay with a triumphant splash. The silence of the crowd erupted into a roar that echoed across the water. They weren't just cheering for a ship. They were cheering for a miracle. They were witnessing the total and complete vindication of an idea that had been dismissed as foolish just 2 years earlier. Vice Admiral Land, his skepticism now fully transformed into awe, stood before the newsreel cameras. His words captured the maritime establishment's forced recognition that the world had fundamentally changed. 6 months ago, I would have called this impossible, he declared, his voice filled with emotion. Traditional shipbuilding wisdom, accumulated over 3,000 years, said you cannot build a proper ship in 5 days. Henry Kaiser has made traditional wisdom obsolete. In that moment, the impossible had become the new standard. The launch of the SS Robert E. Peary wasn't just a victory, it was an earthquake. The psychological shockwave that ripped through the traditional shipbuilding industry was profound and immediate. The very same shipyards that had laughed at Henry Kaiser as an ignorant concrete man, just 2 years earlier, were now silenced, humbled, and terrified. They could no longer dismiss his methods as a fluke or a stunt. The proof was floating right there in San Francisco Bay. They were forced to confront a terrifying new reality: adapt or become irrelevant. In a moment of supreme irony, the presidents of America's oldest and most prestigious yards, places like New York Shipbuilding Corporation, began sending their top engineers to Richmond, not to criticize, but to learn. A confidential report, written by one such executive to his board of directors in December 1942, reads like a total surrender. Kaiser has achieved what our industry considered impossible by refusing to accept our limitations, he wrote. He treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem, not a craft tradition. He simplified where we sought perfection. He standardized where we customized. The result is ships built in 1/10 the time, at 2/3 the cost. We must either adopt his approaches or accept irrelevance, and adopt they did. By early 1943, Kaiser's revolutionary influence had transformed the entire landscape of American maritime production. 18 shipyards across the country were now building Liberty ships using his prefabrication and welding techniques. The results were staggering. The average construction time for a ship fell from 230 days at the start of the war to just 42 days by mid-1943. At peak production, the United States was launching an average of 3 Liberty ships every single day. The grim mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic had been completely reversed. America was now building ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. The logistical artery to Britain was secure, and the path to Allied victory was paved with an endless bridge of steel ships. A total of 2,710 Liberty ships would be built. A fleet so vast it's hard to comprehend, all made possible by one man's refusal to accept the word impossible. But the true legacy of Kaiser's revolution extends far beyond the end of the war. When the fighting stopped, many predicted his shipyards would become rusting ghost towns, and while production did cease, the knowledge born there did not disappear. In a final fascinating twist, the nations that would become the shipbuilding titans of the late 20th century, Japan and South Korea, rebuilt their own maritime industries in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds by meticulously studying Kaiser's Liberty ship program. The massive, hyper-efficient shipyards in Nagasaki and Ulsan that dominate global shipbuilding today are the direct descendants of the revolutionary practices born on the mudflats of Richmond, California. The social legacy was just as powerful. The tens of thousands of women and minorities who had answered the call to work in the yards didn't just go back to the way things were. They had proven to themselves, and to the nation, what they were capable of. They had earned skilled wages, developed new confidence, and kicked open doors of opportunity that would stay open for generations to come. The experience in the shipyards became a crucial catalyst for the civil rights and women's rights movements that would sweep the nation in the following decades. And then there was one of the most unexpected legacies of all. To provide medical care for his massive and often injured workforce, Kaiser partnered with a physician named Sidney Garfield to create a prepaid healthcare program. Workers paid a small, fixed amount from each paycheck to get comprehensive medical care, with a focus on keeping them healthy and on the job. This innovative model, pioneered to serve the shipbuilders, eventually evolved into one of America's largest and most influential non-profit healthcare providers, Kaiser Permanente. The story of the Liberty ship, in the end, is about so much more than ships. It's a timeless lesson about the power of human ingenuity when it is freed from the shackles of tradition. It's proof that our perceived limitations are often just a failure of imagination. The SS. Robert E. Peary, built in less than 5 days, wasn't just a ship. It was a 14 zero-ton statement that conventional wisdom can be wrong, that expertise can sometimes be a barrier to innovation, and that progress requires the courage to ask, why not? Henry Kaiser and his army of everyday workers didn't just help win a war. They changed how we build the world. Many of those patriotic men and women who performed that industrial miracle could be our own parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents. Their stories of quiet courage and incredible achievement are a vital part of our shared history. And that's why I want to ask you. Do you have a story from your own family from that incredible time? Did a family member work in the shipyards, in a factory, or contribute to the war effort in some way? Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored. Please, share their story in the comments below. Every comment is a piece of history, and together, we can build a tribute to the greatest generation. And if you found this story as inspiring as I do, Please hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more of the untold stories of courage from World War II. Thank you for watching.